What strikes me about our closing keynote is that as an investigative journalist for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, she's an incredibly down-to-earth human. She's the host and creator of the ABC's true crime podcast Trace, which in season 1 told the story of Maria James, who was stabbed to death and the killer never found. And now in season 2 follows the story of lawyer Nicola Gobbo, who represented some of Australia's most dangerous criminals while secretly working as a police informer. I know many of you Trace listeners are excited about this session, so let's learn what it takes to create a project like this, because there are many transferable skills for our industry. I introduce you to Rachael Brown, who I commend and appreciate for being a journalist with a heart. Now, before you visually see her, let's set the scene. This is a true crime podcast, so listener discretion is advised. Roll the audio clip, pretty please.
Ask any ex-homicide cop about their biggest regret, and they'll tell you about the one that got away. That case they couldn't quite crack.
Mrs. James was stabbed 68 times in both the front and back and had 3 gashes in the skull.
Some people would say, draw a line in the sand and move on, but I've always had this view. The answer is always in the file.
Ron Iddles is your classic homicide cop. His face lined by years of late nights, fueled with bad takeaway food and worse coffee. Ron spent 25 years as a homicide detective. This year he retired, after close to 40 years in the force, and he's moved to Queensland where he can stay warm and finally relax a little. He hung up his boots with a near-perfect strike rate, 99% of cases solved. But there's one case that he can't quite let go. It was the first homicide case he ever worked on, and it's never been solved.
Homicide and forensic squad detectives spent today painstakingly searching the murder scene.
Maria James was murdered in 1980.
Mrs. James, a mother of 2 boys, aged 13 and 11...
For more than 3 decades, Maria's sons Mark and Adam have lived in a kind of holding pattern.
There is absolutely no doubt whoever killed Maria told somebody.
This is Trace, an investigation into the murder of Maria James.
Oh my goodness. Rachael,
Hello.
how's it going?
Good, how are you going?
Good. You've got my, I'm feeling the emotion from that. I think audio is a true experience of, creating emotion. So this is a global success of a project.
Someone who used to be a friend, someone who used...
Okay. How do you get told that it's not a no, basically? Because we get told no's in life all the time, but you didn't take no for an answer and you brought this to life. Help us understand that.
Yeah, so I think stubbornness is both my weakness and my strength. It was my strength in this case. I stumbled upon a couple of interesting things about this story that I thought would make an incredible podcast. Serial, as you know, had come out in the US and was a hit podcast there. And that kind of piqued my interest in trying to do this long-form investigative journalism in a different way. And it was showing to work overseas. And I thought this would be the perfect forum for something like this. Interestingly enough, I wasn't drawn to the story because it was true crime. So I didn't think I want to do a true crime story podcast. What should I do?
Yeah.
It was the story that grabbed me, and the people involved, Mark and Adam James, who listeners would know, the 2 sons of Maria James, who were left without a mum at a very young age, 13 and 11, that had to navigate the world without their mum. They are incredible men. Ron Iddles, the cop who fought for them, trying to find answers for them. So those people really stuck out for me. So I suggested that we should do it as a podcast at the ABC. And yes, you're right. The first person that I went to said, I don't think there's anything in this. I don't think we should do it. So I just kept being a pain in the bum, really, because every fibre of my being, I felt that it was not only a strong story, but an important story, because the more I dug into it, I was learning that perhaps, there was a church cover-up involved. Perhaps there was a police, either negligence or potentially a cover-up involved there as well. So as a journalist, it was an important story for me to work on. So I just kept pushing. I did a lot of the investigation in my own time around my other job, my shift work at audio current affairs, so AM, PM, and the world today. So I'd work on the investigation around those shifts, and then got to a point where I went to another boss and said, look, we really need to do this. It's an incredible story. It's an important story. And he thankfully supported me and said, yeah, I agree. We'll do a pilot and see what comes of that. And then the rest is history.
So are there specific cues within you that were really, that belief I think is really important, you know, and you were just like, no, I'm doing it, to put commitment in yourself in your own time when people are not believing in what you're doing? What was it specifically within you that was like, this story needs to be told, or I need to do this project for myself? Because that's quite intrinsic, the motivation behind that.
Human motivation for sure. Two level, like the story was really important, and I would have felt negligent as a journalist knowing what I knew and not doing anything with it. So I guess if they had have rejected it again, I would have found another way. Like, do I write a book, which I eventually did end up doing, or can I take it to someone else if the ABC's not going to run it? So they were some things going through my mind as kind of plan B.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, as you mentioned, I'd already put so much work in personally and become close with the family, and felt like I had a bit of an obligation to them to see it through. And also a lot of the other people that I was interviewing, survivors of church sexual abuse, I didn't think that was fair to them to have taken their stories down, their history, and not do anything with that either. So it was seeing the light of day one way or another. And I just, as I said, I just felt in my bones that this, a good story. And I hate even calling it story, because it's not. It's Marie James' life and these two sons' lives. But it was just so important that it saw the light of day, really.
Yeah. Well, I think that's when I say, like, I want to recognize you for having a heart, is what I do recognize is that you care about the humans on the other side. And it's not just about, I got to get this story, this would be good for my ego or my career. And you're really careful with how you balance that. So how did you do that?
That's important to me as a human, more so than a journalist, if that makes sense. Yeah. I think I'm a good journalist because I'm a good human. Sometimes those two things don't go together very well. But I approached both Mark James and Ron Iddles for their blessing, which isn't necessary, but it was necessary for me as a person. So I approached both of them. And Mark James, I had to explain what a podcast was, because he didn't know. I had to explain it to my parents as well. And so once I talked him through what a podcast was and the strengths and how it could tell him his story and Adam's story quite intimately and respectfully, he was all for it, because he was still working on finding answers. And then I went to Ron Iddles and said, look, would you support me? That was a bit trickier. He said, yeah, you have my blessing, but you need Vic Pol's blessing. And I thought, I'm never going to get that. But thankfully, one of the assistant commissioners at the time saw merit in what I was trying to do. So he gave it his blessing. But had those two things not happened, Trace wouldn't have been born. I don't know. I would have felt uncomfortable digging into a woman's life when the family didn't want me to. So, yeah.
Was it ever going to be anything else other than a podcast?
Only if it didn't go anywhere. At work, for example, if I kept coming up against brick walls, I probably would have done the book first. But I think it worked better this way, because a lot of my innovative ideas around the podcast was that this could actually be a force for change. And one of the things that Trace did for the first time in Australia is used audiences as participants, not just consumers. So I would be making call outs for specific information that I needed to try to help the James brothers get some answers. And a book wouldn't have done that as well. Yeah. So I really I needed them. I relied on them, and I said from the start, it's not my job to solve this. I'm one woman. I might not be able to solve it, but it's going to be the community. And Ron Iddles said the same thing. It's going to be the community that solves this. So the podcast, the interactivity of the podcast, and being able to target call outs for a lady that was driving down High Street at a certain time of day, for example, that was really important.
Yeah, because I think we can quite often think we have to do it all ourselves. but we don't have to be the expert, and there's help out there. And obviously that really helped your investigation and tell the story.
I was quite floored and humbled by that, actually, because emails started rolling into the special email address. And I'm talking like 200, 300, 400 emails in the first few weeks.
Wow.
I couldn't keep up. So one of my colleagues helped triage those and separate the kind of the armchair detective theories from real golden leads. And then I would chase up the golden leads, while keep in mind I was still scripting and re-scripting and editing, and the whole thing was evolving as it went to air.
Yeah.
But I think that's what listeners really loved about it. They felt they were part of it because they were in this, unfolding investigation. And the reception from people, I still get teary when I think about it, that they offered support for the James brothers, or they offered, one detective reached out and said, Maria didn't have a proper memorial service. Can I help you organise that, when all this is over? So other than that, as well as leads, people reached out to the family and wanting to offer the family support somehow. They got a lawyer offering pro bono help through Trace. So as a journalist, I've seen a lot of the worst of society. I covered courts for a long time. I've seen depravity and greed and violence, horrific things that, I'll never be able to scratch out of my brain. But doing this in a weird way, even though this was one of the darkest of stories, I got to see the best of humanity as well. Complete strangers reaching out to these men, saying, good on you, keep going. What can I do? How can I help? I think it's been one of the highlights of my career, my life, seeing how people responded to those guys.
Well, I think for the people that are listening and watching at the moment, this is it's really important, the transferable skill here, because it's content curation. It's basically looking at all the information out there and going, what is important. And we're going to get into the process of how you do that now in a second, but also going to people and like that buy-in. Like in our industry, when we talk to people, they feel emotionally involved and they want to help you, and they want to help develop solutions and create opportunities, and then they become your champions as well. So I just want to encourage the people listening to think about that and the transferable skills that we're bringing from this conversation with Rachael. So I want to we are going to break down the process of Trace. We're going to throw to another audio clip in a moment. So I've got my little prop here ready. So people, you're about to hear another audio clip. But before we do that, Hannah, have we got any questions from the audience so far?
We do. This is incredible, Rachael. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a big fan, so amazing. We have a question from Ruth. She wants to know, what do you think the podcast medium has to offer over something more visual?
Intimacy, in one word. The reason I chose a podcast medium was I knew a lot of the people would be nervous about speaking out. Survivors of sexual abuse, Adam James, who has cerebral palsy and Tourette's. I needed to sit with him for a long time. So his interview that you heard, I sat with him for about 5 hours. And because of his stutter, he can take often 2 or 3 minutes to get out something that would take us 10 seconds. So the beauty of radio is that he didn't have a camera like right up in his grill the whole time. It was a little black recorder that was on the kitchen table that he forgot was there, and he could just take his time. And I think the beauty of radio and podcasting allows things to breathe and allows people to relax. And it's just such an intimate space that I don't think Adam James definitely wouldn't have worked as well on camera. I think it would have been very intimidating for him. A lot of the survivors of sexual abuse, I don't think they would have given me their stories if it had to be filmed. It's just such private moments that they let me into. And podcasting is just so powerful. So intimacy would be my answer to that one.
We also have another question from Ruth. What are the attributes of a great podcast?
A compelling story, so a compelling narrative thread, and a driving plot, and then really, really strong people, I would say, interesting people, and some of the people that are coming out of podcasts at the moment aren't necessarily likable. You might have a protagonist that you can't stand, but if they've got a really strong personality, you can start unpacking that. And you know, I like unpacking everyone's complexities.
And we have a question from Sarah. What are the most time-consuming parts of creating a podcast?
Transcribing takes me a long time. Just the tedious. So
you need to outsource that, girl.
I know, but this is before it was commissioned, so I was doing it all myself to prove that I could do it all myself. The one that I'm working on at the moment, the Lawyer X, you know, so the Nicola Gobbo, who was a defence barrister who started being a police informer. A lot of the material before the Royal Commission at the moment is just, there's mountains and mountains and mountains of transcripts and witness statements and then exhibits that I'm having to wade through. So in this case, I would say that that's my biggest time vortex that I keep falling down into.
We also have a question from Sarah. She says, do you think you need to have professional voiceovers to tie the story together? Or are there tips for talking on podcasts for non-professionals? She said your voice is really nice to listen to and she loves your podcast.
Oh,
is that because she's comparing it to mine, or?
Thank you. That's very sweet. This is funny. It's kind of like asking, it's probably not the answer you want to hear, but it's like asking a singer to sing badly. So I find that to do podcasting, they want you to be a lot more conversational and chatty. So when I'm in the booth, even if I say often, they're like, nah, do it again, it's often. And I'm like, no, but I say often. So I was laughing with my script editor the other day that he was trying to bogan me up. But it's like not going to, it's gonna. So they're actually trying to do the opposite with me and make me sound less formal because I'm used to doing news reports, you know, in very, like when we started out, everyone kind of fell into that trap of trying to speak in the Sandra Sully tone with all the, you know, the same intonation. And so I've tried to break out of that. And it's a different medium also, like you've chosen to have me in your ear. So I don't have to command your attention. It's not like if you're cooking dinner and the news is on and the newsreader needs to really command your attention. You've chosen to listen to me. So it's already an intimate space before we even begin. So I've learned how to, particularly with Trace One, I played around with my voice a lot and microphones, and I ended up having one very close to my mouth, almost like I was whispering into it. And I played around with trying to get a lot of intonation and colour in a much smaller space, if that makes sense. And I found I could do a lot more with my voice when I spoke quietly. And we landed on that voice, oddly enough, because I need to be quite soothing in your ear, and they wanted me as the straight man, like straighty 180, just initially stitching all the grabs together, because the story was so unbelievable in itself that I don't need to be kind of jarring or screaming out anything. So for me, for my voice, they didn't want it to be jarring. So I ended up talking how I would when I was used to read my nephew bedtime stories. So it had to be kind of smooth, nothing jerky that would jerk him awake. So each time I'd get into the booth, I'd just think, okay, read Ollie a bedtime story, which is quite weird. I'll tell him about that when he gets older. Not the best murder story to be reading to my little nephew, but that's the kind of mind frame that I got into for my voice. Sorry to answer your question. Yes, definitely anyone can do it. I don't think you necessarily have to have voice lessons, but maybe play around with how you can use your voice differently. It definitely needs to be listenable. But like I said, if you can smooth it out, nothing too jerky, that conversational is a great thing in podcasting. And, you know, we hear lots of different voices on that medium.
Have we got time for one more, Kim?
Go on then.
Okay, so
all about the audience, so
the audience is very excited. Would like to know, what different formats of interviewing do you use?
I don't really have formats as such. When we were talking before about human motivation, I generally think beforehand, I think I just do it subconsciously now, is what's in it for them. Because it has to be, I mean, it's selfish in some degree. For them to commit to an interview, there has to be something in it for them, surely. Yeah. And working for the ABC, it's not money because we can't pay. So, you know, I've not paid for an interview in my life. So they're not doing it for money. So I have to think about, well, what's their incentive? Maybe it's publicity for a cause, searching for answers about their dead mum. For Nicola Gobbo, it was she didn't feel like she was having a voice. You know, everyone was speaking on behalf of her. They called a whole royal commission to look into her, and it looked for a long time like she wasn't going to get a voice. So have a think about, what's in it for them, and why they would be wanting to do it. And, you know, and I'm not saying I do my interviews for people, but I definitely try to put myself in their shoes. And a lot of the people I've interviewed are so brave, like Adam James, for example. I don't know whether I'd be that brave. So I try to empathy is in my work, I find that kind of dictates a lot of what I do and how I ask my questions. Yeah. Politicians obviously are different, or businessmen that you might, you know, those interviews might have to be a little bit more combative. But I generally don't find... Nicola Gobbo is a good example. A lot of people probably thought that I should have gone in a lot harder and a lot more bulldog-ish with her, but I don't find that's how you get the best out of people. That's more if you want to be seen to be being a bulldog, if that makes sense. That's more to do with kind of the journalist and the ego, whereas I don't think that kind of questioning elicits good answers. So if you're trying to get the best answers for your audience, it's not about you. So yeah, I don't have various categories that I drop into in terms of questioning, but it's kind of the way I ask my questions and plan and workshop my questions is, you know, different for all the people that I interview and what their motivations are.
I think that's really nice, and especially for our industry and what we're going through with the event here is it really is around what's in it for them. And we try to say that with our audience, our learners, right? So we always want to start with the why. Simon Sinek has a great TED talk on it. Start with why, then the how, then the what. And I think that comes through with you. The other chats and that we've had today, and you are emphasizing it again, is empathy. You know, you can do things like empathy maps, you can do personas, but you're asking curious questions. And I think what I've pulled from there is don't assume. You know,
oh my God.
On the other side, Nicola Gobbo, what you just said, don't make assumptions.
Definitely. And Trace One taught me that like nothing else. In one of the clips that you've got to play later, you can play it now or later, I didn't even realize I was making assumptions, but one of the priests that Adam James says molested him as a kid, I tracked down someone that used to know the family of Father O'Keefe, and I was hoping that they might have, could point me in the direction of nieces or nephews so I could get a DNA sample. But I just assumed that this person would hate me rocking up at their door, being there at all, you know, and I'd decided that they would hate me. So I left it to the very last minute before episode 4 ran, I think. In the end, they were divine. They hadn't spoken to they kind of were a bit, what's the word? Anyway, they didn't have much time for him as I assumed that they would, Father O'Keefe. And then they were the person that ended up giving me a DNA sample that I could potentially use to compare with, you know, the pillowcase, blood that was found on a pillowcase at the crime scene. You know, this person that I just assumed she'll hate my guts. So that, if nothing else, never assume anything. Yeah.
Okay, audience, I'm conscious of time. Do you want more of a conversation from Rachael and I, or we got a 3-minute audio clip where you can hear like her going excitement, let us know in the chat. But basically she's like, oh my God, I've just been given this thing. And then she talks to a lawyer and all this. Do you want to hear that 3-minute audio clip? Or do you want us to keep going with the questions? Let us know. And Hannah, if you can jump in through audio and let me know what choose our own adventure path we're about to take. Audio. Okay. Put the headphones on, people. 3 minutes. We'll join you back. Thank you. Roll audio.
Someone who used to be a friend of the family got in touch with me. They don't want to be identified, but here's the big news. They gave me something. Something that used to belong to the priest's twin brother. It's odd. This acquaintance tells me that they even held on to this item. There was no reason to. But when they heard I was asking questions about Father O'Keefe, they decided maybe this was supposed to be for me. I quickly call my producer to tell them.
Sorry, I'm just driving home, but guess what's in my handbag? A while ago, I asked Ronnie what I should do if I ever managed to get any DNA. And I asked jokingly because I didn't think it was legal. And he said it is legal. If that happens, put it in a snap-lock bag, label it and give it to the police. Police could check whether it's similar to the DNA found at the crime scene. And if it is similar, it would support their application to the coroner to have Thomas O'Keefe exhumed. It's massive. My life is so surreal at the moment. Oh my God. So I'm just about to call Ron Iddles now and ask his advice about what I should do with this. Hey, how are you?
Good, what's doing?
Oh, I think I might have something.
Very.
So I visited a friend of the O'Keefe family and they gave me personal belongings that could have familial DNA on it. I mean, I obviously was thinking I should give it to police, but what's the...
I think at the end that's the only thing you can do. It'll either eliminate him or it won't eliminate him.
Currently they're in 3 snap-lock bags in my handbag, is that right?
No, so what I would do is, if you can, is cut the plastic bag open, put them in a paper bag and then reseal the paper bag and put the date and the time that you reseal it up. And keep the plastic bags in another bag.
Okay.
Because the plastic will actually cause the clothing to sweat and sometimes destroy the DNA.
Rookie error. DNA 101. Paper bags. I called Victoria Police the next day and arranged a time to drop off the item, but they contacted me and said something had come up. So this evidence, well, it's still sitting in a locker. I asked DNA expert Dadna Hartman whether she thinks O'Keefe's twin brother's DNA could be useful.
You would be able to get nuclear DNA material from things like bloodstains or other sort of biological material like semen, for example. Things like hair, unless they've got the root of the hair, you usually can't recover nuclear DNA, but you could get mitochondrial DNA from a hair of that kind.
This investigation's been tough. Horrific abuse, damaged lives. But for the first time in a long time, I feel a flicker of hope that the James brothers might just get their answers.
All right, people listening and watching. I keep forgetting we're not in a podcast. I want you to reflect in the chat and think about what's resonating with you, how you're feeling after listening, what ideas have you got that you can put in practice for the solutions that you're working on for your learners. Share it in the chat, but Rachel and I will continue on. So Rachel, you were chatting about Nicola earlier, and you were saying things around there's a world of information out there. Now, you've got people giving you information, hundreds of people. You're also following leads and you are doing your own kind of curiosity. How do you sift through that information and figure out what should I pay attention to and what should I let go of?
This one, Trace 2, has been really hard for that because Trace 1 was my own investigation.
Yeah.
So I had access to all the material and I knew where everything was. This is a bit harder because it's the Royal Commission's investigation. So some of the stuff I know is there, I don't have access to, or even the stuff that I do have access to, there's hundreds and thousands of exhibits. So sitting through the Royal Commission helped, even though it was a long year. I've sat through that for most of last year and into this year. So you kind of get a sense of, from a journalist point of view, the story, the very clear narrative flags. And I'm like, how best to tell this story? Maybe I'll use this detective because he was the detective that was her kind of gateway drug into police informing, so let's hear from him. When she did finally kind of put her toe in the water, She burst into tears in front of another detective at the magistrate's courts. I'm like, we definitely need to hear from him, you know, and how he felt this day when a woman that's supposed to be representing a gangland client starts spilling her guts about this client, you know. So all kind of her, you think about her as the protagonist and the main kind of driving plot points in her life and her story. And then what are the best ways to illustrate those plot points? It might be in a particular exhibit, it might be a bit of evidence that the Royal Commission heard, or it might be something that she told me.
Yeah. What drives the motivation behind where you focus your energies? It's your audience.
Yeah, how best to tell this story. Like, this is such a complicated story, and I am a bit worried that a lot of people might go, oh, it's Melbourne's story and it's confusing, and that's why this podcast is so good, because I do start from scratch. Up until now, coverage of the Royal Commission has been this kind of grab bag material about certain days of the hearings, which it has to be because journalists were covering it every day, so you can't give the whole story every day. But a podcast has just been a really nice way to think, well, what are the main things I'm trying to say here? And then how best do I illustrate that? You know, always start with, as you mentioned before, start with a question. What's your question? Because I don't think I'm to blame for doing this a lot too. You just start on a project to not know what your question is. So my brother's a scientist, and he's like, well, what's your question? I'm like, oh, so, let's talk about that later. He's like, no, what's your question? Because if you don't have a question, you can't answer it. So my question for Nicola Gobbo was why, not what. What wasn't really important to me. That's for the Royal Commission to decide what she did, if she did the things that people are accusing her of. But I deal with the why. Like, why would a highly smart, professional, competent defence barrister risk her reputation, risk her career, risk her life to inform against some of the most dangerous people in Australia? Why would someone do that? Yeah. So that was my question. Why turn police informer?
That's really interesting, because what we try to promote is, what is the problem we're trying to solve for our stakeholders or our clients? And another way we frame that is, how might we? So I encourage people, you do have to have a really clear goal, and continuously throughout your process, and you'll relate to this, is this relevant to that goal? Do I have everything I need to be able to achieve that goal, or the next step or milestone in getting towards that goal? Which takes me to basically, you started from scratch. So you have your first draft, right, in projects, and then it goes, you have to hand it over to people, and they need to give you feedback before it goes to air. And you can be emotionally involved in your project. How does that feel? And, how do you deal with that?
That phase is brutal. I hate it every time I have to do it. I have a visceral reaction to it. Like, I feel my back, I get my back up, literally, because I've spent, blood, sweat and tears on this thing, and you hand it over, and someone who hasn't had anything to do with the investigation, this happened both times now with both traces, rips it to shreds, and you have to watch it in real time, especially like if it's in Google Docs, you're actually watching your work like being hacked and struck out, and it's horrible. I hate it. But it's best because the first time round, my script editor, Tim Roxburgh, he came in cold. So I'd done the investigation, and he looked at, well, what are the interesting narrative flags for him? What best tells this story? And because in my first draft, I'd included all the red herrings and all the dead ends that I'd gone down, because I was like trying to be truthful to my journalism. And he cut a lot of them out. He left one in, the real estate, how I chased the wrong real estate agent for 6 months. He left that in, but I had a lot of other ones in there as well. And he's like, oh no, it's too confusing and it's exhausting. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm exhausted, so my listeners should damn well be exhausted as well. And he's like, no, you don't want them to be exhausted. So it was a lot of stripping back, and just back to what it needed. And sometimes it takes, and this is advice I'd give, sometimes it takes fresh eyes. And fresh eyes is really important, because in both projects I've got so stuck in the weeds and stuck on certain things that are important to me because they were at the time, or I might have heard something hilarious in the Royal Commission that just doesn't translate on tape, and I get so attached to these things that really, they don't work, or they don't help the story. So I'm a very detail focused person. Tim that I work with is very plot orientated. So if it doesn't assist the plot, it's gone. Whereas I would argue there are certain details, it's like a meal, detail to me is like the seasoning. So some things work better with more seasoning. But between us, I think we end up with a really nice balance of a careering plot with details that are going to stick in people's minds for a long time. But fresh eyes is definitely key. And I would say this for any industry, because you can get far too attached to your own work. And it is excellent to be, it hurts, it really hurts, but it's excellent to be challenged, because it's what makes your work sing.
Yeah, I like that. Sing. Any particular song or?
No, not at the moment.
I do encourage that as well. I know some people work by themselves, and even just taking a break, going for a walk and getting some fresh air and coming back, you do see your own work through a different lens. So I'd encourage that as well. Now, I want to talk about, your two podcasts, season 1, season 2, you've got very different main characters. You've got this lovable mother of 2, and then this not so lovable other character in season 2. So now, how do you watch your bias and tell the story of the human?
Good question. It's a very good question, actually. Maria James was an easier woman to like, because, single mum, raising 2 kids, murdered. It wasn't hard to kind of get empathy for her. And in terms of motivation that we were talking about earlier, I needed people to feel empathetic towards her, to keep listening, to keep giving me leads, to try to help the boys, which was the thing that I wanted. Like, that was my touchstone. I wanted to help the sons get answers. Nicola Gobbo is a bit different. I didn't think she's a harder woman to like, because she is brash. She's larger than life. You get lawyers that describe her as, she's like, oh, life of the party, big boobs, blonde hair, and that's been the stereotype, I would say, the caricature almost that's been coming out of the Royal Commission, that she was promiscuous, that she's scandalous, that she did things that she shouldn't, she passed on information she shouldn't. And to me, that's quite fascinating, because once I started digging into it, I get the sense that caricature suits, that a lot of people would be happy that that's what we're talking about, the party girl, when kind of you miss the trick, you miss the magician's sleight of hand. What you should be seeing is, well, how was she allowed to do this? Who was encouraging it? She didn't do it on her own. It didn't happen in isolation. That's what we should be talking about. How did it happen? Who encouraged it? Who allowed it to happen? What was going on behind the scenes? So I wanted to explore that, and the kind of assumptions that we jump to about people, about women in particular, in largely a man's world, 2 men's worlds, the legal profession and gangland era, and dig a bit deeper into that.
Do you have any strategies to keep your biases out?
Good. Other eyes helps with that. If, I certainly don't, and this podcast is not me being an apologist for her by any means. I mean, she openly says she did the wrong thing. I just think I have to be, if it turned out to be one way or the other, like if I went too hard on her, or if it was a fluff piece, a lot of people, I think, would tune out, because then they'd start making judgments about me and my journalism. Yeah. So I think it's just really important just to remain at your heart a journalist, and you're supposed to be objective and balanced. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I just think all my work won't be taken seriously if I find myself leaning one way or another. So I did this with Trace One in terms of not pointing the finger at any one person in particular that I thought might be more likely to be the murderer. I don't actually see that as my role. And I think I would be criticised for that. And I also think I could jeopardise court cases if I did point the finger at anyone. You know, we're seeing that play out now. I won't name names, but with some other podcasts, that proceedings might be jeopardised because of what's been said in podcasts. And I certainly didn't want to do that. So I've tried. I just think it's my role to get all the information and send it to you listeners, and then you make your own minds up about it.
Very cool. Okay, one more question, then I'm going to go back to the audience. So get them into the chat, and Hannah will be ready in a second. What I want to know is, so there's episodes, how do you hook people so that they tune into the next episode? What are your strategies and tips?
I think it comes back to a lot's to do with a good skeleton, like a series skeleton, and everything hangs off that. Not crowding episodes with too much information. That comes back to what we were talking about before, the clear narrative flags. And having very deliberate beats. Like think of a song, but it's more about story beats and the pulse of the story. So we kind of, this time around, we're dividing it into, each episode might be 3 acts, and each act might have various story beats within an act. So it's bringing those, accentuating the beats, I suppose, whether that's by a particular piece of information or a really strong grab. And keeping it really clear, because podcasting, as you know, people are doing it, they're listening on the tram, or they're doing it when they're cooking dinner. So it can't be anything too detailed, dense, or too complicated. You can do complicated things, but you have to explain it to people. And that was the mistake I made at the start too. I see explaining, I'm worried that sometimes explaining comes across as talking down to people or spoon feeding people. But the more I do it, the more I realize it's not spoon feeding. It's just helping listeners through it, because there might be, 10 other things going on in their world at that time. So for me, it might be simple as me saying, okay, you need to listen to this bit because it's important.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's cool, because we, like our learners, basically people at work, if you've ever done learning, we are the people that serve you. But we do forget that what we're putting out there is not the only thing going on. So you got to respect people's time, Okay, let's go to the audience. And Hannah, what questions are coming through?
We have a question from Melina. She asks, what tips would you have liked to know when you started podcasting?
Oh, so many. I feel like I kind of fell into it because I thought I had the story, and I thought, well, what's the best medium for my story? Keep it simple. I think my early drafts were far too complicated, way too much detail. And then, I'd end up going down all these rabbit holes that you guys have now never heard about. That's one. And don't get too distracted. Because I'm a news hound, it's like I'd start on something, and then that would lead me to something else, and that would lead me to something else. And I feel like I wish someone had said, now you're like 20 steps off the thing that you started looking into, just to try to come back to that initial drive. I think for the most part, I was lucky. I had a really good team. So, the script editor was brilliant. The series editor, Marty Peralta, does the music. So actually, that's something I wish I'd have known. I didn't appreciate how much heavy lifting the sound would do and the music would do, which sounds ridiculous because I'm working in podcasting. But I came at it thinking that I had to do everything, that I had to carry it, my investigation had to carry it, my interviews. But I hadn't worked with Marty before. So I just thought it would be some music here and there. He is extraordinary. Like, he puts you in that bookshop. That clip that you heard at the start, you hear wind. So he had the idea of feeling like wind was brushing things away over the years. You heard the tinkle of a dog collar. There's a tram in the distance in one of the clips. He puts you there. And so it's like you're walking through the scene with me. So my scripting doesn't have to do as much as I thought it would. You know, it only has to do 60% of the work, because the music and the sound design accounts for so much more than I gave it credit for before I started this. So now Trace 2, I'm writing very differently, because then on an ominous scene, for example, in a lot of parts, I've not written anything. I'm like, Marty can deal with that. Yeah.
We have a question from James. He would like to know, do you try to push the overall narrative in a certain predetermined direction, or does the narrative happen organically as you're interviewing?
The latter. I think it's dangerous if you have, that's why I don't usually go in with questions. I don't write, I write kind of more themes that I want to cover, but there's no point in writing a whole long list of questions, because if you stick to your questions, it doesn't do justice to the interview. You need to be able to pivot. They might say something extraordinary from something you thought was innocuous, so you need to be able to go with them. So no, I don't pick a direction. I have a direction I think it might go in, but you have to be flexible and ready to pivot, or you'll miss it. You'll miss the gold, you know. And I also think you have to be honest with yourself too. Like, if you go in with fresh eyes and be ready to learn, you know, if you've got an idea, if you've got a narrative in your head already, then you're not ready to learn. I think some of the best interviews I've done, or the best grabs, quotes that people have given me, were just when I let it go off in the direction that I had no idea was coming. Cool.
Alice would like to know, did you get any listener feedback that changed the way you made the podcast?
Yeah, there's two ways to answer that.
No comment.
It changed feedback in terms of leads, changed it in a very real way, because we rolled in leads and I investigated them, and the kind of results of my investigation were rolled into the next episode. So because it was evolving as it went to air, that kind of feedback definitely did change it. Episode 2.5 is entirely because of the leads of two women. So you hear from them in episode 2.5 of Trace number 1, the Maria James case. The reason why I smiled is because it was evolving as it went to air. At the start, people were kind of enraptured that they were part of an investigation as it was unfolding. So because it dropped every week, and first they heard that there was a priest found with blood on his hands, and then the next week another priest was involved, and the next week was the DNA bungle, you know, where the pillow that they were using to test against all the suspects was found to be from a completely different crime scene. So because it was evolving as it went to air, people were in it, literally, which they loved, which is not necessarily a good thing, because then we can talk about voyeurism and stuff like that, but they loved it. But then the bad side of that is that and I could gauge the tone of where this was going with, which I forgot to send you, Kim, I'm sorry, the iTunes reviews. So at the start, they were very flattering, you know, well done, Rachael Brown, haven't heard a true crime podcast like this. But then after episode 4, when I had to go away and do some more investigation, and the coroner had to do things and Victoria Police had to do things, because there wasn't another episode the next week, I started to get some resentment about, well, where's ep 5? You promised so much and delivered so little, basically. You know, you said that you'd help solve this thing and now you've disappeared. So it was almost, listeners felt entitled to get another one every week. Some, not all, some did. And were a bit, you know, miffed that they didn't have a next episode to listen to. But I was pretty unapologetic about that. I just, I said in some interviews and things like that, I'm not there. I wasn't primarily there for their listening pleasure. I was trying to help the James brothers get some answers. And at that particular time, I needed to go away and do some more work. And I wasn't going to serve up episodes just for the sake of it. I didn't see that as my role. So that there was a very different shift in tone because of the nature of the podcast.
Yeah. Can I just extend on that? In terms of, and then we'll come back to audience questions, giving you more time, people, to get them into the chat. When people are being critical of your work, how do you know what feedback is important to take on and what is not going to help you achieve that goal that you're working towards?
Yeah, there was one in particular that really bothered me, and it was I won't say his name, but it was a Melbourne law professor who kind of tweeted that he didn't think that podcasting was the right forum to investigate, which I sat with for a long time. First, it really bugged me, and then I'm like, why does it bug you? Just sit with it and think about it for a bit. And then I decided that no, I still think he's wrong. You know, these boys hadn't found any answers within the justice system. Police had let it go. So if not me and this podcast, what else? You know, they're not, how else are they going to get answers? But that one really annoyed me. But like I said, I sat with it for a bit, and I think I didn't get too many haters, which was good. It's the type of material that I was dealing with. I had a lot of people question when I did episode 3. The question before about going in different directions that you hadn't expected. That second priest who Adam accused of molesting him, once I started digging into his past, things like kind of satanic abuse rituals started coming up that I had to deal with. And I did think, well, listeners are going to maybe start thinking that I've jumped the shark, you know. But what we were talking about before, it's not about me, and it's not about what people think of me. And I had a responsibility. That's what I'd found in my investigation. So I thought I had a responsibility to convey that fairly, not as graphically as I was reading, but in a way that was kind of digestible. But yeah, I did cop some criticism for that. But I think it was important to include because that's where my investigations went. And as for the Melbourne law professor, he wrote an article at one stage saying I hadn't traced, there was no real investigative result from Trace. And then 4 days later, the coroner announced a new inquest. So,
oh, wow. Well,
yeah. So I'm sorry, I don't really know how to answer that question. I think I do give it time, and I don't just get my back up and think, oh, they're wrong. I do think about it. Yeah. But yeah.
I think it's, what I'm hearing you say is, you know, don't have an emotional reaction. Look at the facts. Yeah. And I think if you react in the moment, you can have an emotional reaction. But if you take the time to pause, you can see the facts of the situation. And another form of looking for feedback is just because one person says it doesn't mean it's the right way or the wrong way. You know, you need to kind of have a collective group of people giving you feedback. So if someone is critical of your work, what is that about? So go for a wider field of feedback and then get the average of that and take action based on that.
Yeah.
Hannah, go on. You go.
No, that's why it's important to do kind of focus groups and listening groups and stuff like that, because you do get that range that you can draw on that, as I was saying about fresh eyes before, really helps projects.
Yeah. Hannah, we got anything else before we wrap up?
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question. We have a question from Leonard. He says, do you change your pace and tone of your voice after you've heard the music or with the music in mind?
That's a really good question. I do my work first and then Marty works around my voice. So I don't hear, it's not like scoring a film or anything like that. We get the script down pat, fact-checked, legaled, this one in particular, legal to the hilt. And once that's all done, Marty then works his magic around my scripting. There are some times I have to be in the booth for the opener and the teaser at the start of each episode, because I know there'll be the theme running under the start. My voice has to slow a little bit and be a little bit louder and a bit punchier, like it's almost like a promo. And at the very end of each episode, I know that the theme will be running under, you know, next week on episode 2, I kind of need to pick it up a bit. But those are the only times really. Otherwise, Marty just works around me, poor guy.
How are we, Hannah? Any more questions or shall I wrap?
I think I'll have a look. Like we had questions from earlier on, probably one more question I think we'd have time for. Emma wanted to know, what hook do you place at the beginning to make sure people continue listening?
With each story, Usually what your touchstone is, what your question is, I would say, would be the simplest answer. So like I said with Nicola Gobbo, it was why. I wanted to know why. Like, why would someone do this? It's just staggering. With Marie James, it was trying to get answers for the James brothers, you know, and it bugged me because it bugged Ron. And Ron Eddles, the detective that you heard from, has been in this game a very long time. And he said something to me once. He's like, there's someone that knows. There is someone out there that knows in the community for sure. So that kind of stuck in my mind as, we'll put that up top, that someone listening might know, or they know someone that knows. But yeah, a touchstone is really good. It's also really good on the really hard days when you're sobbing, you know, thinking, why am I doing this? And this is consuming my life. My touchstone was the James brothers. So I could keep coming back to that as not only a story touchstone, but like a motivational, personal touchstone as why I was putting myself through what I did to get that project done.
Amazing. Well, as we wrap up, I think the key takeaways are: have a very clear goal, focus on the facts, not the emotion. Don't be emotionally attached to I've heard someone call it a shitty first draft, because there are people out there that can help contribute and get it better towards your goal. And don't make assumptions are probably the biggest lessons that I've taken away. In the comments, would love you guys to, and girls, to, you know, pop in what your biggest lessons are, what you're going to take away and action. And Rachael Brown, thank you so much for your time today. I know that's added a lot of value, and we appreciate all of the sharing and value that you brought.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Nice to meet you.